Black woman blocked from priority check-in.
Moments later, she buys the airline and fires the entire team. You're at the airport, rushing to make your flight, and you step into the priority check-in line.
Everything seems routine, until it isn't.
A woman, calm and composed, approaches the counter with her ticket in hand, but instead of a smooth process, she's met with disrespect, judgment, and humiliation.
What happens next? Well, let's just say this isn't your typical story of customer service gone wrong.
This is about power, justice, and a twist no one saw coming.
Can you imagine being judged before you even speak? Stay tuned to find out how this story flips the script. Before we dive in, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments.
If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to Adam Alpha for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people.
Now, let's get into it. The wheels of Danielle Robinson's leather suitcase hummed softly over the smooth airport tiles as she entered the terminal. The automatic glass doors slid open with a quiet hiss, welcoming her into the bustling chaos of travelers hurrying to destinations near and far. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the sharp tang of jet fuel faintly carried through the ventilation. Danielle paused for a moment, taking in her surroundings with a practiced calm that masked the flicker of anticipation in her chest. Today wasn't just another trip, it was the culmination of months of meticulous planning, long nights, and quiet sacrifices. This flight would take her to the final meeting where she would secure a deal that could change everything, not just for her, but for the legacy she was building. She tightened the silk scarf draped around her neck, its soft hues contrasting elegantly with her tailored cream coat. Her demeanor was polished, composed, yet approachable, qualities that had earned her respect in rooms where she was often underestimated. Danielle's heels clicked softly as she navigated through the throng of travelers, her stride purposeful, unhurried, exuding the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in any room she entered. What would you do if someone tried to stop you from claiming what's rightfully yours? Keep watching to see how Danielle turns the tables. The terminal's overhead signs guided her toward the priority check-in area, the words gleaming in polished silver letters above a roped-off section of the terminal where luxury met efficiency, a space designed for travelers who paid for comfort and ease. The line at priority check-in was refreshingly short. A handful of passengers stood ahead of her, tapping on phones or exchanging pleasantries with the staff. Danielle stepped into the line, adjusting her grip on the passport holder in her hand. The sleek leather case held more than her travel documents, it held years of effort, triumphs, and reminders of the path she had carved for herself. As she approached the counter, her gaze shifted to the man stationed behind it. He was young, no older than 30, with sharp features and an air of self-importance that seemed exaggerated for his role. His name tag, neatly pinned to his crisp uniform, read Carter. He moved with a precision that bordered on briskness, his tone clipped but polite as he processed the passenger before her. Yet, there was something in his eyes, a flicker of impatience, or perhaps judgment, that Danielle caught in the brief glance he cast toward her. She didn't react. Years of navigating spaces where she wasn't expected to belong had taught her to remain poised, to let the assumptions of others reveal themselves without giving them undue energy. As the passenger ahead of her finished and rolled their suitcase away, Danielle stepped forward. "Good morning," she said with a polite smile, sliding her passport and ticket across the counter. Her voice was steady, warm, devoid of the entitlement often expected from travelers in first class. Danielle believed in kindness, even when it wasn't reciprocated. Carter glanced at the documents, his eyes narrowing slightly as he read the details. For a moment, his expression was neutral, professional. Then his brow furrowed, and he looked up at her, his demeanor shifting subtly but unmistakably. "This line is for priority check-in," he said, his tone slow, as if explaining something to a child. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" The question hung in the air, each word laced with an assumption that Danielle had encountered before. It wasn't just the question, it was the way he asked it, the faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, the way his gaze lingered just a moment too long on her. Danielle's polite smile remained, though a flicker of irritation crossed her mind. She straightened her posture slightly. "Yes, I'm sure," she replied evenly. "That's why I'm here." Carter's smirk deepened, as if he had been waiting for that answer. He glanced at her passport again, then at the ticket.
He muttered, his eyes narrowing.
This doesn't seem right. Let me check something. Danielle watched as he tapped furiously at his keyboard, his fingers a blur.
She stood quietly, resisting the urge to say more, letting the moment play out. Around her, the terminal continued to buzz with life, announcements echoed from overhead speakers, families exchanged hurried farewells, and the rhythmic beeping of nearby luggage scanners filled the space. But here, at this counter, time seemed to slow as Carter leaned into his assumptions. "I'm sorry," he said finally, looking up with a mock apologetic expression.
"This ticket doesn't look valid. Are you sure you booked this through the airline?"
Danielle's heart remained steady, though her patience began to thin. She had expected to breeze through this interaction, as she always did at priority check-in. Instead, she found herself at the center of unnecessary scrutiny. "Yes, I booked it directly," she said, her voice firm but measured. "Perhaps you should double-check." Carter hesitated, clearly not expecting her to stand her ground. He glanced at her again, his gaze sharp and appraising, before reluctantly continuing to type. A few moments later, his smirk returned. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his tone teetering on condescension, "but I'm going to have to call someone to verify this."
"Do you have any proof that this ticket is yours?"
Danielle's grip tightened slightly on the handle of her suitcase, but she kept her composure. She leaned in just enough to command Carter's attention without raising her voice. "The ticket is mine," she said firmly, "and I'd suggest you be very certain about how you proceed next." Carter blinked, momentarily thrown off by her calm authority, but then his expression hardened, and he gestured to a nearby security guard. Danielle stepped back slightly, allowing space but refusing to shrink under the weight of his assumptions. The guard approached, his presence adding another layer to the tension. Danielle remained silent as Carter explained the situation, exaggerating the details in a way that painted her as suspicious.
Passengers nearby began to take notice, some whispering, others openly watching.
Danielle could feel their eyes on her, the judgment in their glances, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and retrieved her phone. She scrolled to a familiar number and tapped it, lifting the phone to her ear. "Hello," she said softly, her tone steady but laced with quiet determination.
"It's me. We need to handle something."
As she ended the call, she turned back to Carter, her eyes meeting his with a calm intensity that made him falter.
She didn't need to say anything more. This was just the beginning.
Danielle lowered her phone, sliding it back into the pocket of her coat. The guard standing nearby shuffled awkwardly, clearly unsure how to proceed. His hands hovered near his radio, his eyes darting between Danielle and Carter, as if he were silently debating whether this situation warranted escalation.
Danielle didn't give him the satisfaction of breaking her composure.
Instead, she adjusted the scarf around her neck with deliberate calm, her gaze steady as she waited for the inevitable fallout from her phone call. Carter, on the other hand, seemed emboldened by the attention of the growing crowd. His smirk widened, and he leaned casually against the counter, exuding an air of smug authority. He turned to the passengers in line, speaking loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You see, this is why we have protocols," he said, his voice dripping with false professionalism.
"Priority check-in is a privilege, not a right. We can't just let anyone waltz in without verifying their credentials." Danielle's fingers tightened imperceptibly around the handle of her suitcase. She inhaled deeply, letting the comment settle in the air without reacting.
Over the years, she had learned the art of patience, the ability to let others unravel themselves with their own words. A woman in line, dressed in a navy pantsuit and holding a leather briefcase, glanced at Danielle with a mixture of sympathy and unease. Her lips parted as though she wanted to say something, but she hesitated, instead averting her gaze back to her phone. A few others shifted uncomfortably, exchanging murmurs that were just loud enough to carry. Danielle caught fragments of their whispers. "Unbelievable, doesn't look like she belongs here, maybe she's faking it."
The words weren't new.
They were the echoes of countless moments she had endured in boardrooms, at social events, and even in spaces she had paid handsomely to access. But today was different. Today, she was in control, even if Carter and the onlookers didn't know it yet.
The faint clack of hurried footsteps broke the tense silence.
From across the terminal, a man in a dark gray suit was weaving his way through the crowd, his pace quick and purposeful. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his badge, clipped to his jacket pocket, gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The words Airport Operations Manager were just visible as he drew closer. Danielle's sharp eyes caught the slight sheen of sweat on his brow and the stiffness in his gait, signs of someone who knew they were stepping into a precarious situation. The manager reached the counter and immediately addressed Carter, his voice low but firm.
"What's going on here?"
Carter straightened, his smug demeanor faltering slightly under the manager's scrutinizing gaze. He gestured toward Danielle, his tone taking on an exaggerated sense of righteousness. This passenger was trying to use the priority check-in line with a suspicious ticket, Carter explained.
"I was just following procedure to ensure everything was legitimate. You understand, of course." The manager didn't respond immediately.
Instead, he turned to Danielle, his expression shifting to one of polite concern.
"Ma'am," he said, his voice softer now, "may I see your ticket and ID, please?"
Danielle handed over her passport holder without a word, her movements calm and deliberate.
The manager opened it, his eyes scanning the documents inside.
As he read, his expression changed almost imperceptibly, his brows lifted, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. He looked up at Danielle, his posture straightening as though he had just realized who he was speaking to.
"Miss Robinson," he said, his tone now laced with deference. "I deeply apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced."
Carter's head snapped toward the manager, confusion clouding his features.
"Wait, what?" he blurted out. "You know her?"
The manager ignored him, focusing entirely on Danielle.
"If you'll allow me, I'd like to personally escort you to the lounge while we sort this out. This situation should never have occurred." Danielle tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but unreadable.
"And what exactly do you mean by sort this out?" she asked, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made the manager flinch slightly.
"Well," the manager stammered, "we'll, conduct an internal review of the check-in process," and Danielle held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Her gaze shifted to Carter, who was now visibly uncomfortable, his smirk vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped frown as he looked from the manager to Danielle and back again. "Mr. Danielle prompted, raising an eyebrow at the manager. "Bradley," he supplied quickly. "Greg Bradley, ma'am." "Well, Mr. Bradley," Danielle continued, her tone cool, "I'd like you to clarify something for me. Is this the standard of service your priority check-in staff is trained to provide? Public humiliation, baseless accusations, and outright disrespect?" Bradley swallowed hard, his face reddening. "No, ma'am, absolutely not. This is unacceptable, and I assure you it will be addressed immediately." Danielle let the words hang in the air for a moment before she nodded slightly. "Good," she said, "because I'd hate to think that this kind of behavior is tolerated at an airline I've invested so much in." Carter blinked, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out. The color drained from his face as the weight of Danielle's statement sank in. Bradley, meanwhile, looked as though he wanted to sink through the floor. "I'll give you both a moment to reflect on what that means," Danielle said, her voice calm but firm. "In the meantime, I'll wait here for the response from my team." She turned her attention back to her suitcase, adjusting its position slightly, as if she hadn't just sent shock waves through the room. Around her, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, curiosity and astonishment rippling through the passengers who had witnessed the exchange. Danielle's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the message that had just arrived. A small smile played at the corner of her lips as she read it. The wheels she had set in motion were turning faster than she had anticipated. The storm was just beginning. Danielle's smile faded as she slipped her phone back into her coat pocket, her expression returning to its calm, composed state. Around her, the airport seemed to shift subtly, the once bustling terminal now felt quieter as passengers leaned in to watch the unfolding drama. Some pretended to scroll through their phones, but their darting glances betrayed their curiosity. Others whispered to companions, their words too hushed to reach Danielle's ears but clear enough in intent. Carter was no longer smirking. He stood stiffly behind the counter, his confidence eroding with every passing second. His fingers drummed nervously against the polished countertop, and his gaze flicked to the manager, Greg Bradley, who had broken into a visible sweat. The weight of Danielle's presence had shifted the atmosphere,
and the two men were acutely aware that they were no longer in control of the situation.
Bradley cleared his throat, his voice strained as he tried to regain some semblance of authority.
"Miss Robinson," he began hesitantly, "if you'd prefer, we can move this conversation to a more private location, perhaps the VIP lounge."
Danielle raised an eyebrow, her gaze steady. "You seem eager to get me out of sight, Mr. Bradley. Why is that?"
The question caught him off guard. His mouth opened, but no immediate answer came. Instead, he fumbled for words, his discomfort growing more evident by the second. It's for your comfort," he stammered, "and to ensure that this situation is handled with the utmost discretion."
Danielle tilted her head slightly, studying him.
The silence stretched between them, thick with tension, until she finally spoke. "My comfort wasn't a concern when your employee decided to humiliate me in front of a crowd," she said, her voice even but sharp enough to cut through the fragile pretense of professionalism Bradley was clinging to.
"So why is it a priority now?"
Bradley's face reddened further, and Carter shifted uncomfortably beside him, his fingers still twitching against the counter. Before Bradley could muster a response, the distant sound of approaching footsteps drew everyone's attention. The clicks of polished shoes against the tiled floor grew louder, and moments later, two men in tailored suits appeared. One was tall and lean, with an air of quiet authority; the other, shorter but stockier, carried himself with a no-nonsense demeanor. Both wore badges clipped to their lapels, marking them as senior executives from the airline. Danielle turned slightly to acknowledge them, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. The taller of the two stepped forward, his hand extended in greeting.
"Miss Robinson," he said, his tone warm but professional, "I'm Thomas Reed, Vice President of Customer Relations.
My colleague here is David Lynn, Head of Operations.
We received your call and came as quickly as we could." Danielle shook his hand briefly, her grip firm. "Mr. Reed, Mr. Lynn, thank you for coming."
The executives exchanged brief, tense glances with Bradley, who now looked as though he wanted to disappear entirely. Carter stood frozen, his earlier bravado completely extinguished. Thomas Reed's gaze shifted to the scene around him, the crowded terminal, the hushed whispers, the unmistakable tension hanging in the air. He frowned slightly before addressing Bradley. "Greg," he said, his voice low but firm, "a word, please." Bradley nodded stiffly, stepping aside with Reed, their voices lowered as they spoke in hushed tones. But the occasional phrase drifted toward Danielle's ears: "Unacceptable, damage control, this cannot happen again."
Meanwhile, David Lynn approached Danielle directly, his expression contrite. "Miss Robinson," he began, "please allow me to personally apologize for this incident.
This is not the standard of service we strive to provide, and I assure you that corrective measures will be taken immediately."
Danielle studied him for a moment, her expression giving nothing away. "Corrective measures," she repeated. "And what might those entail, Mr. Lynn?"
Lynn hesitated, clearly unsure how much authority he could assert without consulting Reed. "Well, we'll begin with a thorough review of the check-in process," he said cautiously, "and disciplinary action will be taken against any staff found to have acted inappropriately." Danielle's eyes flicked to Carter, who stood rigidly behind the counter, his face pale. "That's a start," she said, "but I'll be expecting more than just a review and vague promises of discipline." Lynn nodded quickly, eager to placate her.
"Of course, Miss Robinson. I'll personally oversee the process to ensure."
He was interrupted by Reed's return, his expression grim. Bradley trailed behind him, his shoulders slumped in defeat.
Reed addressed Danielle directly, his tone firm but deferential.
"Miss Robinson," he said, "I'd like to formally apologize on behalf of the airline for the treatment you've received. I assure you, this is not reflective of our values or our commitment to our passengers."
Danielle nodded slightly but didn't respond immediately.
The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the faint hum of the terminal. Finally, she spoke. "I appreciate your apology, Mr. Reed," she said, "but apologies alone won't fix the deeper issue here.
This isn't just about me.
It's about how your staff interacts with passengers they perceive as different."
Reed's jaw tightened, and he nodded.
"You're absolutely right, Miss Robinson, and I take full responsibility for ensuring that changes are made to address these issues." Danielle studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. "Good," she said, because I'll be holding you to that. She turned her attention back to Carter, who flinched under her gaze. As for him, she said, her voice calm but unyielding, I trust you know what needs to be done.
Reed's eyes flicked to Carter, his expression hardening.
Effective immediately, he said, his tone cold, you're relieved of your duties. Carter's mouth opened in protest, but no sound came out. His face was a mixture of shock and disbelief as the weight of Reed's words settled on him.
Danielle didn't linger to watch his reaction.
She turned back to Reed and Lynn, her composure unwavering. I'll leave the details to you, she said, but rest assured, I'll be following up. With that, she picked up her suitcase, her movements as fluid and graceful as when she'd arrived. The crowd parted as she made her way toward the VIP lounge, her presence commanding respect without a single word. Behind her, the murmur of the crowd grew louder, and the staff scrambled to regain control of the situation.
But for Danielle, the matter was far from over.
This was just the beginning of a much larger shift, one that she intended to see through to the very end.
The VIP lounge was a world apart from the bustling chaos of the terminal.
The soft hum of conversation and the muted clinking of glasses filled the air, a stark contrast to the earlier tension Danielle had endured. Plush armchairs and sleek glass tables were arranged strategically, offering privacy without isolation. A waiter approached her immediately, bowing slightly as he offered her a menu, but Danielle waved him off with a polite smile.
She didn't come here to relax.
She chose a seat near the tall glass windows overlooking the tarmac, the distant roar of jet engines a reminder of the journey ahead. From her vantage point, she could see the sprawling runway, where planes lined up like soldiers awaiting their commands. Her reflection in the glass was calm and composed, but beneath the surface, a storm brewed. Danielle pulled out her phone, tapping it lightly against her palm as she considered her next move. The executives' apologies had been swift and polished, their promises laden with corporate jargon, but experience had taught her to dig deeper to ensure the change wasn't just a fleeting performance for her benefit. She opened her contacts, scrolling until she found the number she needed. The line rang twice before a deep, assured voice answered.
Miss Robinson, what can I do for you?
Good morning, Nathan, she said, her tone steady but clipped. I need a full status report on our acquisition. Has the deal officially closed?
Yes, ma'am, Nathan replied. As of yesterday, the contracts are finalized. You now hold controlling interest in the airline.
Danielle allowed herself a brief smile, satisfaction flickering across her face.
Perfect.
I'll need an updated personnel file, specifically the priority check-in team at this airport. I also want a summary of any complaints filed against them in the last 12 months. Nathan paused, his tone becoming cautious.
Is everything all right, Miss Robinson? Did something happen?
Let's just say, Danielle replied, her voice sharpening slightly, I've had a first-hand look at why this acquisition was necessary. There was a moment of silence on the line before Nathan spoke again, his voice firm.
Understood.
I'll have the files to you within the hour. Danielle ended the call and placed her phone on the table in front of her. For a moment, she stared out at the runway, her mind racing with plans.
The incident at the check-in counter wasn't just a personal affront, it was a symptom of a larger problem, one that she now had the power to address.
But power, she knew, was meaningless without precision. She would need to tread carefully, ensuring that her actions sent a clear message without undermining the airline's operations. Her thoughts were interrupted by the approach of Thomas Reed and David Lynn. The two executives had clearly been summoned to the lounge by her presence, their expressions a mix of tension and determination. Reed carried a leather folder, while Lynn held a tablet, both prepared for whatever Danielle might demand of them next. Miss Robinson, Reed began, his tone deferential, thank you for allowing us to join you. We wanted to personally update you on the steps we're taking to address the situation. Danielle gestured to the chairs opposite her, her demeanor calm but unyielding.
Please, sit. The men obeyed, settling into the chairs with practiced ease.
Reed opened his folder, pulling out a neatly typed report. First, I want to assure you that the employee in question, Carter, has been terminated, effective immediately. We've also initiated a review of our customer service protocols to identify any gaps that may contribute to incidents like this.
Danielle nodded slightly, her expression unreadable. And what about Mr. Bradley? Reed hesitated, exchanging a brief glance with Lynn. Mr. Bradley has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the review, he said carefully. While his actions weren't as egregious, we believe it's necessary to evaluate his leadership during this incident. Danielle's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't interrupt. She let the men continue, knowing that silence often prompted people to reveal more than they intended. Lynn leaned forward, tapping his tablet. Additionally, we're implementing immediate training sessions for all frontline staff, focusing on bias awareness and customer interaction. This will be rolled out across all priority check-in teams nationwide. For the first time, Danielle's expression softened slightly. That's a start, she said, but training alone isn't enough. Culture doesn't change with seminars and handouts. It changes with accountability. Reed nodded quickly. You're absolutely right, Miss Robinson. We'll be working closely with HR to ensure that our evaluation processes reflect this. Danielle leaned back in her chair, her gaze sharp but thoughtful. Good, because this incident wasn't just about one employee's behavior. It was about a systemic failure, and systemic issues require systemic solutions. Reed and Lynn nodded in unison, their postures attentive, as though they were students taking notes from a professor. Danielle's phone buzzed softly on the table. She glanced at the screen, seeing a notification from Nathan. The personnel file she had requested had just been sent. She picked up the phone, scrolling through the document with practiced efficiency. Names, titles, performance reviews, and complaints all laid out in neat rows. As her eyes scanned the file, one name stood out: Carter Miller. His record was dotted with minor infractions, rudeness to passengers, complaints of unprofessional behavior, but none had resulted in serious consequences. It was a familiar pattern, one Danielle had seen in countless organizations: problematic employees allowed to linger because no one wanted to address the root cause. She set the phone down and looked back at the executives. I'll be reviewing these files myself, she said. In the meantime, I expect a detailed report on how you plan to address not just this incident, but the underlying issues that allowed it to happen. Reed nodded quickly, his pen flying across his notebook. Of course, Miss Robinson. You'll have the report by the end of the day. Danielle allowed herself a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. Good, because as of now, this isn't just an airline. It's a reflection of me, and I don't tolerate failure. The weight of her words settled over the room, and for a moment, neither Reed nor Lynn spoke. Finally, Reed stood, offering his hand. Thank you for your patience, Miss Robinson, he said. We won't let you down. Danielle shook his hand briefly. I trust you won't, she said. As the executives left, Danielle turned back to the window, her reflection once again staring back at her. She wasn't just here to solve a single problem, she was here to change the narrative. And she knew that sometimes, change required more than just words. It required action, precision, and an unwavering commitment to see it through. The storm she had unleashed was far from over. Danielle sat alone in the VIP lounge, the faint hum of the airport in the distance. Her reflection in the expansive glass windows mirrored her composed exterior, but behind her calm facade was a mind steadily working through the threads of the situation. The faint buzz of her phone broke her focus. She picked it up and saw another message from Nathan. It was concise: updates prepared. Call me when ready. She set the phone down gently, her fingers resting on its cool surface as she stared at the text. Nathan had always been efficient, a quality she valued in her tight-knit circle of advisors. But efficiency was only one piece of the equation. What she needed now was precision and perhaps a touch of justice. Danielle glanced at the personnel file again, her eyes narrowing as they scanned the details of Carter Miller's employment history. His record was riddled with warning signs, instances of minor infractions that, when seen collectively, painted a picture of an employee emboldened by an unchecked system. Her attention shifted to Greg Bradley, the airport operations manager. His profile was less damning but equally telling: years of steady, unremarkable service with no major blunders, but also no significant leadership accomplishments. It was clear that Bradley had built his career on playing it safe, deflecting responsibility rather than taking bold action. Danielle tapped the table lightly,
her mind piecing together the strategy that would guide her next moves. Her thoughts were interrupted by the quiet sound of footsteps approaching from behind. She turned her head slightly and saw a waiter standing a respectful distance away, his hands clasped neatly in front of him.
"Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly, "I noticed you haven't ordered anything. Can I bring you something to drink? Perhaps a coffee or tea?" Danielle hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod. "A green tea, please. No sugar."
Right away, the waiter replied with a slight bow before retreating. As the waiter disappeared, Danielle leaned back in her chair, her mind momentarily drifting to the events of the morning. Carter's sneering face, the murmurs of judgment from the onlookers, and Bradley's fumbling attempts at damage control, all of it had been familiar in an exhausting way. But today, she hadn't just been a passenger subject to their biases. Today, she had been an observer, an analyst, and, most importantly, the woman holding the reins. Her tea arrived moments later, the delicate aroma wafting from the cup as the waiter placed it gently in front of her. Danielle murmured a soft thanks, taking a moment to savor the warmth of the cup in her hands before taking a sip. The bitterness of the tea grounded her, sharpening her focus as she prepared for the next step. With a steady hand, she dialed Nathan's number. "Miss Robinson," he answered promptly, his voice clear and professional. "I've gone through the files," Danielle said, her tone measured.
"I need clarification on something. The performance reviews for Carter Miller, who signed off on them?"
There was a brief pause as Nathan consulted his notes. "Most of them were approved by Greg Bradley," he replied. "It looks like he downplayed several of the complaints, categorizing them as minor incidents that didn't warrant further action."
Danielle nodded to herself, her suspicions confirmed. "And what about Bradley's record? Any patterns I should know about?"
"Bradley's been with the company for over a decade," Nathan said. "No major incidents, but also no standout accomplishments. He's been effective at maintaining the status quo, which might explain why he's overlooked issues like this."
Danielle's fingers drummed lightly on the table as she considered the implication.
"I want a full report on his handling of staff complaints over the past 5 years," she said, "specifically how often he's taken action versus how often he's deflected responsibility."
"Understood," Nathan replied.
"I'll have that ready for you shortly." Danielle ended the call and set the phone down again, her reflection in the window staring back at her, its calm exterior masking the storm of thoughts swirling beneath. She wasn't angry, anger was too fleeting, too uncontrollable. What she felt was a quiet, simmering resolve. Her musings were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps once again. This time, it was Thomas Reed and David Lynn, their expressions slightly more composed than before but still tinged with unease. Reed carried another folder, while Lynn clutched his ever-present tablet. "Miss Robinson," Reed began as they reached her table, "thank you for meeting with us again.
We've prepared some additional information for your review."
Danielle gestured for them to sit, her calm demeanor unshaken. "Let's hear it," she said. Reed opened the folder, revealing a stack of neatly typed documents. "Following our earlier conversation, we've conducted a preliminary review of the priority check-in team at this airport. We've identified several areas of concern, including gaps in training and oversight." Lynn leaned forward, tapping his tablet to bring up a chart. "We've also compiled data on passenger complaints specific to this location," he added. "The trends suggest a pattern of inconsistent service quality, particularly among newer staff." Danielle listened quietly, her gaze shifting between the two men as they spoke. When they finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "This data confirms what I already suspected," she said, "but addressing the symptoms isn't enough. We need to dig deeper and address the root causes." Reed nodded quickly, his pen poised over his notebook. "What do you propose, Miss Robinson?" Danielle took a sip of her tea before responding. "First, I want a full audit of all priority check-in teams across the network, not just performance metrics. I want qualitative feedback from passengers, anonymous surveys from employees, and an analysis of how complaints are handled." Reed scribbled furiously while Lynn nodded in agreement. "Second," Danielle continued, "we need to re-evaluate the leadership structure at this location. Bradley's inaction has contributed to the current culture, and that's unacceptable. I expect a detailed plan for replacing or retraining leadership to ensure accountability moving forward.
Reed glanced at Lynn, then back at Danielle.
We'll get started on that immediately, he said.
Danielle's gaze sharpened.
Make no mistake, she said, her voice firm, this isn't about damage control.
It's about transformation. I'm not interested in surface-level fixes.
I want lasting change, and I'll be watching closely to ensure it happens. The weight of her words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither Reed nor Lynn spoke. Finally, Reed nodded, his expression resolute.
We understand, Miss Robinson, he said. You have our full commitment.
Danielle offered a faint smile, her eyes gleaming with determination. Good, she said, because failure is not an option.
As the men left to begin their work, Danielle turned back to her tea, the faint bitterness a reminder of the challenges ahead.
Change wouldn't come easily, but she was ready for the fight. The reckoning had begun, and Danielle Robinson was just getting started. The lounge had grown quieter, the mid-morning rush dwindling into a lull as passengers filtered out to their respective gates. The sun shone through the expansive windows, casting long golden shadows across the carpeted floor. Danielle remained seated by the window, her hands resting lightly on the table. Her tea sat untouched now, the once warm liquid cooling to room temperature, yet her mind was far from idle. She picked up her phone again, the faint glow of the screen illuminating her focused expression. Nathan's latest email awaited her, marked by the subject line, Requested Analysis, Bradley and Team Trends.
Danielle opened it, her eyes scanning the detailed contents with a practiced efficiency.
The report was exhaustive, breaking down every complaint, every incident, and every decision, or lack thereof, made under Bradley's oversight.
A pattern emerged quickly, as Dan had anticipated.
Bradley's tendency to avoid confrontation was well documented, his leadership style marked by a preference for maintaining surface-level harmony rather than addressing underlying issues. Complaints about Carter Miller had been dismissed or downplayed multiple times, each instance further emboldening his behavior.
Danielle shook her head slightly, a flicker of frustration crossing her features. She tapped her phone, dialing Nathan once more.
Miss Robinson, he answered, his voice steady as always. Nathan, she said, her tone low and thoughtful, the report is thorough, but it's also damning.
Bradley's negligence has cultivated a culture of complacency.
We need a strategy to ensure this doesn't happen elsewhere.
Nathan didn't hesitate. Understood.
I'll work on a plan to implement stricter accountability measures across all leadership roles.
Would you like me to include guidelines for escalating unresolved complaints directly to corporate?
Yes,
Danielle replied, and make sure those escalations are tied to measurable consequences.
If a manager chooses to ignore a problem, they'll know exactly what's at stake.
Consider it done, Nathan said.
Danielle ended the call and set the phone down again, her reflection in the window staring back at her, its calm exterior masking the storm of thoughts swirling beneath. She wasn't angry, anger was too fleeting, too uncontrollable. What she felt was a quiet, simmering resolve. Her musings were interrupted by a soft knock on the edge of the open lounge doorway. Danielle turned her head to see a woman in a crisp navy suit standing there, her posture straight but not rigid. Her dark hair was tied neatly at the nape of her neck, and her expression carried a blend of professionalism and curiosity.
Miss Robinson, the woman said, stepping forward slightly, my name is Amanda Lee. I'm with the Airline's legal department. I was asked to provide support with any issues that may arise during your visit.
Danielle studied her for a moment, noting the way Amanda's hands rested calmly at her sides and the slight tilt of her head that suggested attentiveness.
She gestured to the seat across from her. Please, have a seat. Amanda sat down, folding her hands neatly in her lap.
I understand there's been an incident this morning, she began, her tone measured. I want to assure you that we take these matters very seriously. If there's anything I can do to assist, please don't hesitate to let me know. Danielle's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in appraisal. Amanda's words were carefully chosen, but there was a sincerity in her tone that caught Danielle's attention.
How long have you been with the airline, Miss Lee? Danielle asked. Just over 5 years, Amanda replied. I've primarily worked in compliance and corporate governance. And what's your assessment of the company's current culture? Danielle's question was pointed, her gaze steady.
Amanda hesitated for only a fraction of a second, her professionalism unshaken. The company has strong foundational values, she said carefully, but there's always room for improvement, particularly when it comes to consistency in implementing those values across all levels.
Danielle allowed herself a faint smile.
A diplomatic answer, she said, but not an inaccurate one.
Amanda's posture relaxed slightly, though her focus didn't waver. If I may ask, Miss Robinson, what are your priorities as we move forward from this incident?
Danielle leaned back in her chair, her expression contemplative. My priority, she said slowly, is to ensure that this airline becomes a model for excellence, not just in service, but in integrity.
That means addressing not just the symptoms of systemic issues, but their root causes.
Amanda nodded, her eyes thoughtful. I can help with that, she said simply.
Danielle raised an eyebrow, intrigued. How so?
I've worked closely with the compliance team on several initiatives, Amanda explained. If you're looking to overhaul processes and hold leadership accountable, I can provide insights into where the gaps are and how to close them.
Danielle studied her for a long moment, her mind weighing the potential.
Amanda's confidence was quiet but undeniable, and her willingness to engage directly suggested a level of competence Danielle found refreshing.
Very well, Danielle said finally. I'll be relying on you to ensure this process is as thorough as it needs to be. Amanda inclined her head slightly, a faint smile touching her lips. You won't be disappointed, Miss Robinson. As Amanda left the table, Danielle turned back to the window, her reflection now joined by the silhouette of planes taxiing along the runway.
Change was coming, not just for the airline, but for everyone within it.
And Danielle Robinson, as always, was ready to lead the way.
Danielle remained seated for a while longer after Amanda left, letting the quiet of the lounge settle around her. The sunlight had shifted, bathing the space in a warmer glow as the day progressed. Outside, the distant movements of planes and baggage carts served as a reminder of the machine she was now at the helm of, vast, intricate, and powerful. But even the most robust machine, she knew, was only as effective as its weakest link. Her phone vibrated softly against the table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Nathan, executive briefing scheduled for 3 p.m. recommendations attached.
Let me know if adjustments are needed. Danielle opened the attachment, scrolling through the document he'd prepared.
As always, his work was meticulous. The recommendations were structured into 3 phases: immediate corrective actions, short-term restructuring, and long-term cultural shifts. She scanned the bullet points, nodding to herself as she read.
Nathan understood her vision well, but there were always nuances to be addressed.
She leaned back in her chair, contemplating the next few hours. The briefing would be pivotal not only for addressing the fallout from the morning's incident, but for setting the tone of her leadership. This wasn't just about making promises or issuing apologies. It was about establishing a blueprint for transformation, and transformation, she knew, required both precision and patience.
Danielle pushed the door open with a measured grace, the sound of its hinges silencing the low murmur of conversation.
All eyes turned to her as she entered, her presence commanding the room without a word. She placed her leather-bound notebook on the table and took the seat at the head, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Thank you all for being here, Danielle began, her voice steady and firm. This morning's incident was unacceptable, not just in how I was treated, but in what it revealed about the deeper issues within this organization.
We're not here to discuss damage control. We're here to discuss transformation.
She let the words settle, watching as the weight of her statement registered on their faces. Reed shifted slightly in his seat, his pen poised over his notebook. Bradley avoided her gaze, his fingers nervously tapping the edge of the table.
Danielle turned her attention to Nathan, who was seated to her right. Nathan, walk us through the recommendations. Nathan nodded, standing as he clicked a button on the tablet in front of him. The screen at the front of the room lit up with the first slide of a presentation titled Operational Accountability and Cultural Transformation Plan. The plan is divided into 3 phases, Nathan began, his tone crisp and authoritative. Phase 1 addresses immediate corrective actions. This includes a comprehensive review of all priority check-in teams nationwide,
focusing on performance metrics, complaint histories, and customer feedback. Any employees with consistent patterns of misconduct or underperformance will be subject to re-evaluation, up to and including termination.
Danielle's gaze shifted briefly to Bradley, who was now staring intently at the table.
The implication of Nathan's words was clear: no one would be exempt from scrutiny. Phase 2, Nathan continued, focuses on short-term restructuring. This involves implementing new leadership training programs, revising customer interaction protocols, and establishing clear escalation procedures for unresolved complaints.
Additionally, all managers will be required to undergo mandatory bias awareness training. Danielle interjected smoothly, her voice carrying a note of finality. That training won't be a one-time session. It will be part of an ongoing commitment to excellence. This isn't about checking boxes, it's about creating a culture that prioritizes respect and accountability. Nathan nodded, moving to the final slide. Phase 3 addresses long-term cultural shifts. This includes the creation of an internal task force to monitor compliance and oversee the implementation of new policies. We'll also establish anonymous reporting channels to empower employees to speak out without fear of retaliation. As Nathan finished, the room fell silent, the weight of the plan settling over the executives like a tangible force. Danielle let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking. "This isn't just a strategy," she said, her tone calm but resolute. "It's a commitment to every passenger who entrusts us with their journeys, a commitment to every employee who deserves a workplace built on respect and integrity, and, most importantly, a commitment to ensuring that this airline reflects the values we claim to stand for." Reed nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "It's an ambitious plan," he said, "but it's necessary." "It is," Danielle agreed, "and it's non-negotiable."
She turned her attention to Bradley, who had remained silent throughout the presentation. "Mr. Bradley," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "you've been in your role for over a decade. Tell me, what have you done to address these issues during your tenure?" Bradley shifted uncomfortably, his face reddening.
"Miss Robinson, I've always tried to maintain a smooth operation."
Complaints were handled as they arose, and Danielle held up a hand, silencing him. "Smooth operations don't mean ignoring problems," she said, her tone sharp but measured.
"Your job isn't to avoid conflict, it's to address it."
"That's what leadership requires."
Bradley swallowed hard, nodding mutely.
"I expect your full cooperation during this transition," Danielle continued, "but make no mistake, your role is under review, as is everyone else's in this room. Accountability starts at the top." The room was silent again, the weight of her words pressing down on them.
Danielle leaned back slightly, her expression calm but unyielding.
"This is the beginning of a new era for this airline," she said, "and I expect every one of you to rise to the occasion.
Failure is not an option."
With that, she closed her notebook and stood, signaling the end of the meeting. As she left the room, the sound of her heels echoed down the corridor, each step a reminder of the unrelenting resolve she carried. The first steps had been taken, the foundation was set, now the real work would begin. The hum of the engine was steady as Danielle leaned back in her first-class seat, the cabin dimly lit for the evening flight. The meeting earlier had gone as expected, with promises of compliance and dedication from the team. But she knew the real test would come in the following weeks, as the policy she had mandated began to ripple through the airline's operations.
This flight wasn't just another leg of her journey, it was deliberate.
She had chosen this route, a high-profile transcontinental one, because it was known for its luxurious service and its undercurrent of entitlement among certain staff and passengers. If there was anywhere the old culture of the airline might rear its head, it would be here. The flight attendant approached her seat with practiced grace, her uniform crisp and her smile polished.
"Miss Robinson," she said softly, "may I bring you a drink before takeoff?" Danielle studied her for a moment, noting the meticulous attention to detail in her presentation.
She smiled faintly.
"Just water, thank you." The attendant nodded and stepped away, her movements smooth and precise.
Danielle's gaze followed her briefly before turning back to the window.
Below, the airport lights stretched endlessly, tiny beacons of activity against the darkened landscape.
She sipped the water that soon arrived, her thoughts drifting to the strategy ahead.
As the flight ascended, Danielle couldn't help but observe the dynamics in the cabin. First class was nearly full, its passengers a mix of business executives, well-dressed leisure travelers, and the occasional celebrity. The attendants moved seamlessly between them, offering champagne and pre-dinner snacks.
For the most part, the interactions were professional, but there were moments, small, nearly imperceptible moments, where old habits lingered. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit snapped his fingers impatiently, summoning an attendant with the kind of casual entitlement that made Danielle's jaw tighten. The attendant hesitated, her smile faltering slightly, before hurrying over. The man leaned back, his tone clipped as he made an offhand comment about the temperature of his drink.
Danielle's gaze lingered on the interaction, her expression neutral but her thoughts sharp. Moments like these weren't isolated, they were part of a broader ecosystem, one that allowed subtle imbalances of power to flourish unchecked. She made a mental note to revisit the training materials Nathan was preparing. Bias awareness wasn't just about overt discrimination, it was about addressing the subtleties, the microaggressions that could erode the foundation of respect she was trying to build. Midway through the flight, the atmosphere shifted. Dinner service was underway, the clinking of cutlery and soft murmurs of conversation filling the cabin. Danielle was halfway through her meal when she noticed another interaction that caught her attention. A younger black woman, seated a few rows behind her, was speaking quietly with an attendant. The woman's expression was polite but firm, her gestures indicating some sort of disagreement. Danielle couldn't hear the words, but she could see the tension in the attendant's posture. The woman's demeanor wasn't aggressive, but the attendant seemed defensive, her responses sharp and hurried. It wasn't long before another flight attendant joined them, her presence diffusing the situation slightly, though the underlying discomfort remained. That evening, Danielle reflected on the journey that had brought her here. What had started as a moment of personal humiliation had evolved into a mission far greater than herself. She had faced resistance, skepticism, and moments of doubt, but she had met each challenge with the same resolve that had propelled her throughout her career. This wasn't just about one airline or one incident, it was about what could happen when someone refused to accept the status quo, when they demanded more from the people and systems around them. Danielle knew the work wasn't over. Transformation wasn't a destination, it was a process, one that required constant vigilance and care. But as she looked out at the horizon from her hotel suite, the city lights twinkling below, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The storm she had faced that day at the check-in counter had been the catalyst for something far greater than a single act of justice. It had sparked a movement, one that would ripple far beyond the walls of the airline. Danielle Robinson leaned back in her chair, her lips curving into a small, confident smile. The future wasn't just bright, it was hers to shape. And she was ready. And just like that, the tables were turned. What started as an act of disrespect became a powerful lesson in humility and justice. Danielle Robinson didn't just stand up for herself, she used her influence to create lasting change, proving that true power lies in taking action when it matters most. If this story inspired you or kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell for Adam Alpha. We've got plenty more stories filled with twists, lessons, and unforgettable moments coming your way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.